Junius has walked us through to the point where he's talking about the inseparable external operations of the Trinity. And as we saw last time, he wants to be able to say the Father is the creator, the Son is the redeemer, the Spirit is the sanctifier, that this is it's a creedal way of talking, it's a biblical way of talking. And so without denying that, he wants to go back and say, and yet the Father's not exclusively personally the creator to the exclusion of the Son and Spirit, because the same creed that calls God the Father, maker of heaven and earth, goes on to talk about the role of the Son and the Spirit in creation. So partly you could deal with this by way of appropriations, and he's talked about that some. But what we've got to deal with today is that he also wants to affirm the inseparable external operations of the Trinity, that any action between God and the world, any action of God towards that which is not God, is the action of the one God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.
Yeah, and I think that this is one of the places where we see what we do with the essence of God, or the De Deo Uno, distribute and just basically transfer the implication for what we have to do without, of course, collapsing the real distinction in God of one person in order to another in relation to another, keeping that obviously intact. Nonetheless, when we turn away from that line of relation in God to, as you say, something that's not God, outside of God, then we're reverting back to basically what we do with the essence of God and how God acts towards the world, and God acts as the one God, because God is the one God.
Yeah.
So I think that's what we're doing here in a Trinitarian explanation, though. So.
Yeah. And so there are certain sort of boundaries or rules in place, because you want to speak in a way that makes sense with how the Bible speaks. You also want to speak intelligibly, so that if, as faith accepts these things and then seeks understanding, you don't frustrate people by saying, look, I don't know, that's just how it is. You know, at some point you're talking about God himself, and you have to say, look, I don't know, that's just how it is. But if you're trying to make claims like all external actions are undivided operations of the Trinity, and yet only the Son is incarnate, and yet the incarnation as a created thing is the created work of the entire Trinity. You want to put those things out there and then offer enough by way of clarification and explanation that, you know, we're not trying to be rationalists here and satisfy that kind of a high bar or claim of what reason can understand, but we're also trying very hard not to be irrational, trying to give the mind something that it can rest in and understand.
Right. And you mentioned there, Fred, I think basically the effects involved in what we call missions. Yes. Those, I think, would be the primary effects that we're concerned about to do justice with respect to. Is that correct? Are there other things we're...
Yeah, it really is. It comes down to the missions, because, you know, you could take the parting of the Red Sea to pick a major, important, miraculous intervention by God in salvation history. And it doesn't raise the same kind of questions like, you know, did Father, Son, and Spirit part the Red Sea? Is there any way in which I need to say it was especially the Father or exclusively the Son at any point in that? No, that just doesn't arise with any divine actions that aren't missions.
Okay, so I'm hearing that there's a seeming conflict, at least apparently, between the speciality of certain effects and the non-speciality, or the undividedness over here. We have these certain effects and then that. So I think that's broadly what we're concerned to do justice.
Yeah, the missions, but then also the example I started with, creator, redeemer, sanctifier. These are sort of like mega divine acts, right? I can point to the parting of the Red Sea and say, this is theoretically datable. Like, that's exactly when that happened. Whereas I can't point to creation and say, you know, that one thing God did. Well, it's literally that one thing God did toward us. It's, you know, it's the master act within which all this conversation occurs. Yeah. But that's the one where creedally we're directed to say God the Father is maker of heaven and earth, because by appropriation that instructs us in something about the personal characteristic of the Father. But it's not a claim that God the Father exclusively, omitting the Son and the Spirit, single-handedly made heaven and earth.
Right. So they all do it, but only the deed is like the Father.
It's like the Father. That's right.
Got it.
Yeah, it's instructive. Okay. Well, we're starting right in the middle of Junius's thesis 29, because he accomplished one kind of movement of thought, and now he's going to get a little more detailed here. And then we'll try to take on all of 30 if we can. Junius says, rather, this is such that the distinction in the persons is only extended according to their principle to the term, which, according to the divine economy, is some person. Maybe we can stop right there and clarify the words he's using, because then he's going to go on and make another move. Principle, you could say cause, but principle's a broader, an even broader term than cause. It's the originating point. It's that from which.
Yeah. The source is another way to.
Oh yeah, source is a good word. Yeah. And then when he says term here, there's this terrible ambiguity when we talk about this in English. Term sounds like we use term to mean a special specified sense of a word, right? Like define your terms. But throughout this conversation, it almost always means term, like terminus, terminating point, end point, that to which. What's the opposite of source? Source and goal?
Yeah, source and end.
Yeah, good. So the distinction in the persons is only extended according to their principle to the term, which according to the divine economy is some person.
Yeah, I think that, I'll just be honest and say I do struggle a little bit with the wording that Junius is using, in the sense that I don't really understand why he's using the words he's using. I do understand the point he's making, and that's broadly that from the perspective of the effect that emerges from God acting as one undividedly, that effect has various relations to its cause. Mm-hmm. And if we consider its relation to the divine essence, that's basically where the undivided axiom is coming up. But if we consider how it terminates or participates in, that's often an easier way to get around what the idea is, because the idea of terminus ad quem, term towards which, is the participating point, or that whereon something depends or is hung, such that it takes on, or rather that on which it's hung takes on ownership of this effect, but nonetheless that ownership is from the effect itself, not from up in God when we look down to the effect. And that's a little tricky for people to follow, because it sounds really weird. I don't know. Is that broadly your understanding, Fred?
I mean, if you're drawing this on the whiteboard and you've got the three persons in the Trinity, at no point do you want to draw lines down from each of them into created effects. Like the Father does this thing over here, and the Spirit does this thing over here. So I've got lines straight down from the persons into personal agency, distinct from each other, as distinct from each other as the persons are distinct from each other, because the persons are, I mean, that's a real distinction, right? It's not just a rational distinction. Yeah, I mean, it's real relative. You can tell them apart because of how they are related to each other.
Yes.
Yeah. Instead, what you've got is you've got the three persons, then you've got unified, you've got non-divided divine action.
Right.
But in such a way that the result, the created effect of that unified divine action can reflect the threeness of the persons in their relation to each other. But not by, like, I don't know, if the Trinity moves a rock, it's not like the Trinity has to move three rocks so that you can then say, like, that one the Father moved, that one the Son moved, and that one the Spirit moved. The undivided external action of the Trinity can move the rock, and you can say, the one God did this.
Right. So there's a line from some effects that terminates to one of the persons, and such that that person properly owns the effect and is said to be hypostatically united in the case of one very important effect. Taking ownership.
So this is one of these difficult areas where it helps to keep backing up and saying, he's talking funny, what's he afraid of, right? Like, he's putting it this way in order to ward off some misunderstanding. And one would be, like, you don't at any point want three distinct agents separate from each other, causing different things in creation. It's indistinguishable from polytheism. Like, just like, what is this multiple agents way of talking? But you also don't want to agentify the substance. When you say the one triune God does this, you don't want to make this mistake of saying, well, there's only one nature, only one divine nature, and that nature causes things to happen.
Right.
It's a kind of a, it's like the Trinitarian analogate of Nestorianism, where you make an essence do the acting and then swear you didn't just create a fourth person.
Yes.
Even though you did functionally by treating the nature as a person. Yeah. So I agree. It's hard to tell what the main danger is that Junius is talking kind of strangely in order to avoid. I come to this just from having read a bunch of Gregory Nyssa, and I think they're clearly saying the same sort of thing. They're vexed by the same problems that they're trying to solve in very similar ways. But Nyssa seems to have a different main danger in mind, back in the 5th century.
Yeah, and on that point too, it's probably also helpful to note very clearly what they're not trying to do.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that I've noticed a lot of folks try to do when we get into these types of topics is they look at the operatic induisa axiom, and they try to shove in that some Trinitarian shapifying of the effect such that it comes out of God and bears it reiterates the Trinity as it is distinct up in God, rather than just participating in the being of God, and that's where we do all the stuff that we do with respect to the essence of God.
Yeah.
And that's not what the fathers are concerned to do. They actually don't think you can do that. It goes down very, very bad lines. Not what the medievals are trying to do. They're just concerned, on the one hand, to affirm the undividedness, mm-hmm. and then preserve the real termination of some effects, particularly those involved in mission, such that the Son alone is said to die, mm-hmm. and not the Father. And such that, for instance, when we have the invisible missions, each person dwells within us, and the entire Trinity, as the persons are in themselves or in God with respect to each other, we participate in the soul, in grace, these types of things as well.
Yeah. Okay, good. I was just glancing down at the next bit, and maybe we can't say anything more without getting into dialogue with what Junius says next, because he gives an explanation. He says, this is because the commonality of operation does not remove the individual arrangement of persons among themselves to the singular term of that arrangement in any, albeit common, operation. I mean, I think this highlights one of the things he's concerned about. He's afraid that if you get this, emphasize this common operation, that it will remove the individual arrangement of persons among themselves. So everything you just talked about, this kind of, even this modern tendency to say this stream of divine action that comes down is like, it's a threefold braid of unified action, and I can pick out the strands of Father, Son, and Spirit, right? Yeah. I think I heard you say one time, like, it's shimmering Trinitarianly, even though it's unified action. Like, those of us who know can spot Father, Son, and Spirit going on in that unified thing.
Yeah, or we're supposed to spot.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe we can't spot, but if you have faith, you can spot.
Yeah. So Junius is concerned. He doesn't solve it the same way that we just talked about, but he's concerned that if all you say is common action, you're going to obliterate our ability to see the individual arrangement of persons among themselves. But I will say in this passage, he's only looking for the individual arrangement of persons among themselves in God, like actually at the level of the relations among Father, Son, and Spirit. Yeah. Which I think, again, I've got Nyssa on my mind here. So this is like Greek patristic theology, though Junius is well informed by the history of the reception of that pro-Nicene Greek patristic theology. Nyssa's short version of this is going to be from, through, and in, right? That everything God does is from the Father, through the Son, in the Spirit, because in the eternal life of God, everything is from the Father, and by everything, of course, we mean the Son and the Spirit, and everything is through the Son. Yeah. Nyssa is so clear that everything is through the Son that he even sounds almost filioquistic when he talks about this, because he wants to make sure that the Spirit too is through the Son.
Yeah.
But he's not filioquistic, right? Because he's Gregory Nyssa. Nevertheless, this central role of the Son in the life of God means that everything is from the Father, everything is through the Son, and then everything reaches its perfection in the Spirit. Yeah. So that the Spirit's less of a, like the Son's more of a channel, the Spirit's less of a channel. But this is all statements about the inner life of God. He gets there apophatically, but he is still, when he talks about this arrangement of the persons with regard to each other, that's what he's talking about, the relations of origin.
Yeah, I've understood that. I know the medievals and neo-scholastics, for instance, Ruiz Montoya, 17th century neo-scholastic, has the largest work on Trinity I have ever seen in my life. It's 1,000 folio pages of double column, very tiny, paleography laden Latin. It's just ridiculous. It's this massively long chapter about from, through, and in, and divine prepositions and all the texts in Scripture. And this is a really beautiful chapter. But what's underlying is a very complex appropriations move that you do have to keep in your back pocket. Otherwise, fromness and throughness and inness become, you can't say the essence of the persons, because we restrict essence, as a sanctified word over there, but they become what the persons are, rather than, the phrase you always like to say, instructively like those persons, and meeting and fitting up with the relative identity of what each person is.
Right. And also to keep yourself from accidentally sort of dumbing it down, the from, through, and in is not the same thing as saying beginning, middle, and end. Because if you simplify it to beginning, middle, and end, then you could just take every divine action and say the Father starts it, the Son conducts it, and the Spirit finishes it. But that's obviously the kind of, that's how three people work on a project. I start a project, send the file to you, you send it on to a third person to finalize. That is not how the Trinity works inseparably. Beginning, middle, and end is just way too simple. It's not the same as from, through, and in.
Right. So this would be, let me see if I can get this right, and you correct me. Beginning, middle, and end can be appropriated, but it's a much longer span of negation and notness that you have to undergo than from, through, and in, which are already pulled away from the errors involved in this similitude or likeness, such that they're more like and not less like.
Yeah. Good. All right. Well, let's see how much of 30 we can get to. And it kind of depends on how complex it all is. We just sort of front loaded a lot of it into what he says at the end of thesis 29. In 30, Junius says, thesis 30, now, however these operations are common to the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, they are not singular to one person. But still, to mention this in passing, each of the operations is one in number, because in order for an action to be one in number, it is not required that it be one in hypostatic principle, because the efficient cause is not of the substance of action, but only this, that there is one act, whether commonly or singularly, one effect and mode. Here, let me say the part that's clear about that first.
Okay.
The part that's clear is Junius is saying there's no rule in place that says a unified, undivided act has to, therefore, originate from a single hypostatic source.
Yeah.
I don't know who would make up that rule. Probably someone who feels like, someone who's reading this theology and feels like you're stealing Trinitarian action from them.
Yeah.
And they would want to blow a whistle and say, listen, if it's only the Son who's incarnate, then it's got to be only the Son who is the single hypostatic source of the created action of the incarnation.
Yeah.
And Junius is just saying, like, that's not a rule. You just made that up. It could, there can, in fact, there are three hypostatic principles. It's hard to know what word to use here. One of the problems with talking about this is it would be cool if someone had absolutely nailed down which words apply to which things, and we only ever use them that way. But that is not the situation. We're not in that situation in any tradition, no, as far as I know. Never mind getting the traditions to sort of talk with each other. So when I say principle, it can have too many meanings all at once. But Junius is just saying it is in fact the case that Father, Son, and Spirit are the hypostatic sources, plural, of the unified divine action.
Yeah.
Singular.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right.
And that shows that I was just, again, from looking at Nissa this week, has been the action of the three, like the one action of the three. Yeah. Just a simple, tightly packed phrase for what he's talking about.
Yeah.
And then there's the negative work, right? It's these three are not separated from each other by space. So like if three sculptors are working on one large sculpture, they are several feet apart from each other. Mm-hmm. And so they're each doing their own section, but that's not how the Trinity acts. Or if they're taking turns, then they're separated from each other in time, but that's not how the Trinity acts. So you just go through more and more refined denials of various separations among agents and say none of those obtain with the undivided external operations of the Trinity.
Yeah, and I think one important point that's worth mentioning here is that type of unity just is a consequence of the essential unity before God acts. You can't say before God acts too strongly because that gets you into trouble. But when God is and no creatures are, before God acts, they are already one, according to essence. Everything is absolutely one, singular, same, these types of things. And that's what is being pulled over here and preserved or distributed when we turn to the operation or the action, which is flowing forth from God, which is also not something that you can literally say. There's a lot of metaphor going on there, and it is intelligible, and the meaning behind those types of phrases is good.
Yeah,
you have to not hypostasize action in between God and creatures, for instance.
Right. And this is one of the things that from, through, and in helps with, right? Like before God acts, the Trinity is perfectly unified, and there is a from, through, in dynamic within the being of God, right? That all things are from the Father through the Son in the Spirit. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, it's hard to picture what that would be when you abstract from creation and all of God's outward acts. Like, well, just, in the happy land of the Trinity, above all worlds, there is from, through, and in, characterizing the divine life itself.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. The last thing that Junius does here, then, it's another mouthful, but again, we'll just try to get the parts that are clear and maybe point to the parts that are a little more obscure. In these operations, it lies just this way, as is clear from Christ's words when he says he is operating the same which the Father operates. That's John 5:19, that the Son does what he sees the Father doing. The same, note, in number of the act, the effect, the mode. Yes, and beyond the unity of these things, each of these operations is also one in the common principle, which is the divine essence.
Yeah, I do have a little bit of a bone to pick with Junius here. I don't know. This last sentence is really great for him to include, but I think it would have been most helpful. Maybe his plausible deniability, he says, I'm just proceeding in the order of learning here. But when you finally erupt on this, oh yes, they're also one because it's one common principle, one essence. That needs to be really, really strongly upfront.
Especially if...
Yeah, go ahead.
If you've already talked about the three persons as principles, right? Yeah. It's not required that it be one in hypostatic principle. And then here he's saying, but it does have to be one in common principle, which is the divine essence.
Yeah.
It would be cool if we had different words to consistently use, so we didn't have to make principle do double duty just by using adjectives. Like, well, that's hypostatic principle, but this is substantial principle. Well, neat. Could we make up words for that? Or do we just have to distinguish that we're using principle in different senses? And in order to be, clear and not self-contradictory, we just need to name the sense in which we're using the word principle. But you're right. He ends with like essential principle or something. The common principle, which is the divine essence. You're suggesting it would have been good to start with that as a kind of a de deo uno emphasis.
Yeah, I'm always concerned to root things in what they ought to be rooted in. And a lot of these distinctions are actually only rational distinctions. Mm-hmm. So for instance, the operation of God is not really distinct from the essence of God. It's only rationally distinct, because with us and among creatures, operations are really distinct from essences.
Yeah.
However, that rational distinction, in order to preserve truth, as our intellect is verified by what God is, you have to root things in the things that they are rooted in. Otherwise, the created reality, which is sourcing our knowledge of God, is entirely cut away from, and you don't have any intelligibility, and you can't do that. So, very frequently we conclude to things in the order of learning, ordo dicendi. Mm-hmm. And if we were going along that line, we would say, look, Christ and the Father act as one. Look, there's one effect, John 5:19. But this is not why they're one, but a result of their being one. And we have to continue to force that up. And that's really what we're not doing that here, because we already demonstrated that the Son is God.
Yeah.
So, maybe I'm being too picky, but.
Yeah. This is where, Junius is doing a number of things at once here, and it's hard to know what to emphasize. This is where an opponent would help, you don't have to write polemically all the time. You can just luxuriate in the truth of God. But sometimes to try for readers to understand, like, what is the point you're making? Sometimes it's really helpful. It's very instructive to have an opponent, or to know sort of what the main danger is, or lacking that, to at least say, we're trying to balance between these two opposite errors. None of that's going on. If I were trying to if it were my job to absolutely sell Junius on this one, I would say, we need to attend much more closely to John 5 and even to the history of interpretation of John 5, as Augustine and Aquinas and company work out what it means for the Son to only do what he sees the Father doing. Mm-hmm. There are long exegetical discussions of, I think it's Augustine who's so good about this. He just walks his audience through. So do you think the Son has like a telescope and he's looking at what the Father's doing and he sees it, writes it down, and then goes and imitates it? No, that's not what's going on here. How does the Son see what the Father's doing? And he goes on for a couple more pages, and basically the answer is eternal generation. Like, yes. That's basically what that means. Yeah. And also for the Son to do what the Father does, that's also eternal generation. That's what all of this comes down to. Yes. And Aquinas takes that and even goes to the next level with it. But it's not that there's an opponent in view. It's getting deeper into the meaning of what Jesus says in John 5. Yeah. So it's possible that Junius is doing something like that, though he's underplayed his quotation of John 5. It could be an exegetical logic driving this. Though, yeah, it could use a little more cleanup on, a little more guidance here on how to use the word principle.
Yeah. Do you have any idea, Fred, what the mode means? I have no clue. I mean, number of the act, okay, I think I know what that means. Number of the effect, yeah, got it. No idea what the mode means.
That section kind of ends with a pileup of alternative nouns you could use, right? There is one act, whether commonly or singularly, one effect, and mode.
Yeah.
I know that he's really emphasizing unity here in multiple different ways. Yeah, I don't know. One way of, there is one act, one effect, one, thinking double negatively here, if he's trying to exclude, if someone's got the bright idea of saying maybe they work in a unified way, but in different modes, like maybe within the one divine action, you can see 3 different ways of working. And he's just trying to exclude that and say, no, you can't, don't go on a mode hunt here. You know, you won't find a fatherly mode of operation and a sonly mode of operation within this action. He's not worried about the Trinitarian heresy of modalism. He's you know, right. It's a different use of the same word here, that you won't be able to find those kinds of traces of the Trinity in the unified divine act.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that is the end of thesis 30. And all that's left actually in this treatise is, in this disputation, is a kind of a summary thesis, which we'll get together and talk about next time.
All right.